On the evening of October 2nd, 1921, people of all ages from Roslyn and surrounding communities gathered in the building that is now the Bryant Library in Roslyn, New York, to dedicate it as the Roslyn War Memorial. While it was certainly a celebratory event, they were here to remember the young men from Roslyn who had given their lives in service to their country during World War I, a conflict so devastating that it was known as the War to End All Wars. The announcement in the Roslyn News read, "While 3 years has elapsed since the last gun was fired, only a faint remembrance is held of the horrors of this war. Soon they shall be forgotten by the majority, but the memorial building in Roslyn will ever stand as a tribute to brave and dangerous deeds, heroic actions, and as a living memorial of self-sacrifice on the altar of warfare." The residents who spearheaded the effort wanted the memorial to be more than a statue or stone monument. Instead, they hoped to create a more tangible way to commemorate their boys, the 146 men from Roslyn and the 10 who died in the conflict. According to records in the local history collection, they envisioned something practical and patriotic, a building that would be a feature in the daily life of the people of Roslyn and vicinity and a living evidence of their appreciation of what has been secured to them by America's part in the late war. Although communities across the country were building memorials to the young men who fought, the concept of a memorial building instead of a statue or freestanding monument was somewhat novel. From what we can ascertain, Roslyn's War Memorial Building was the first such memorial building constructed on Long Island. This building, which came to be known as Memorial Hall, has been a fixture in Roslyn for over a century. It has been the home of the Bryant Library since 1952. The library, which is recognized as the oldest continuing public library in Nassau County, New York, was established in 1878 following the death of its namesake, poet and journalist William Cullen Bryant. The history of the building can best be understood in the context of the history of the Roslyn community. Today, the area we think of as Greater Roslyn includes the incorporated villages of Roslyn, Roslyn Estates, Roslyn Harbor, East Hills, and Flower Hill, and the unincorporated areas of Roslyn Heights and Greenvale. However, for centuries, well before the villages were incorporated in the early 1930s, when people referred to Roslyn, they were referring to these geographic areas as well as to surrounding communities such as Brookville and Old Westbury to the east, East Williston and Albertson to the south, Manhasset to the west, and Glen Head and Port Washington to the north. Roslyn Village was a small village in a valley, bounded on the north by Hempstead Harbor and surrounded by the Wheatley Hills. With its access to water, it was a commercial and industrial center of the North Shore. Through the early 20th century, commercial life centered on the mill dam, what is now Old Northern Boulevard. On the north side of the street was the grist mill, which operated between the early 1700s and 1916, and 2 lumber yards, one on either side of the Hempstead Harbor Creek. There was a sawmill and a silk mill in the area for much of the 19th century as well. There were carriage makers and blacksmith shops, pharmacies, meat markets, grocers, and dry goods stores. There were hotels of various sizes for travelers passing through Roslyn or visiting to relax and enjoy local scenery and attractions. 3 ponds south of the commercial center provided the water to power the paper mill and the grist mill. However, the land around what is now Roslyn Pond and Silver Lake was a mosquito-infested swamp and dumping ground. Reminiscences in our collection indicate that it was necessary for residents to take daily doses of quinine to combat malaria and that some people moved out of the village to higher ground in the Highlands area that developed as Roslyn Heights. By the turn of the 20th century, the North Shore of Long Island was beginning to earn the moniker the Gold Coast, as individuals with great wealth purchased large swaths of land in the Wheatley Hills and constructed mansions and great estates. Land that was once woods or farmland was developed into polo fields, golf courses, or other places of leisure. The second highest spot on Long Island was located in the hills south of the village. It was known as Harbor Hill. The land was privately owned by the Tabor family, but they allowed the public to use the area. It was a popular picnic spot, reached by paths and roads from the village. In 1899, silver baron John W. Mackey, who made millions in the Comstock lode of Nevada, purchased 200 acres of land from the Tabors, including the highest point. He gave it as a wedding gift to his daughter-in-law, Catherine Dewar, upon her marriage to his son, Clarence Hungerford Mackey. Over the years, Catherine and Clarence purchased adjacent tracts until they owned more than 600 acres of land. The Mackeys' estate, Harbor Hill, now a residential neighborhood known as Country Estates at East Hills, became a self-sustaining community with a farm, dairy, greenhouse, and recreational facilities, as well as over 100 employees. Catherine hired noted architect Stanford White to design their French chateau-style mansion, which was built on the highest point. Other smaller estates were also developed in the hills surrounding the village. For example, a 70-acre estate was built by Walter Oakman in 1905 on what one article called a barren promontory, on farmland owned by the Onderdonk family. Originally named Oakdean, it was renamed Waldene when it was purchased by Henry and Lucy Walbridge in 1915. It is now the Roslyn Pines neighborhood on Mineola Avenue. Building and keeping these estates running required workers, and there was an influx of immigrants to the community. The newcomers hailed from England, Scotland, Germany, Ireland, Italy, Poland, and other European countries. Some lived on the estates on which they were employed. Some settled in the North Roslyn Greenvale area. Others settled in the Heights area around the train station and in the landing area near Hempstead Harbor. Roslyn had long been touted for its picturesque location and slower pace of life. By the early 1900s, less wealthy but still affluent New Yorkers from Manhattan and Brooklyn purchased or built country homes on smaller tracts of land. Brooklyn attorney Ernest Cuyler Brower and his wife Marion Willits Brower came to Roslyn in 1910. They purchased 7 acres of land in the hills on the west side of Main Street that included a 19th century house known as Locust Hill. It still stands today at 110 Main Street. The Browers and other newcomers to the community were very civic-minded. An article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle newspaper described Ernest Brower as one of the prominent ones who were interested in betterment of the Roslyn community. In 1913, Ernest and Marion Brower joined with other full and part-time residents to establish the Roslyn Neighborhood Association. Officially incorporated in 1915, the Roslyn Neighborhood Association Board was composed of representatives of all the local businesses, religious, and fraternal groups. The RNA's earliest focus was on improving sanitary conditions in the village. However, the swampy condition had to be addressed first. In Marion Brower's written recollections, she explains that she and her husband spearheaded the initiative to clean up the area because their family was personally impacted. Marion recalls the circumstances. I found that I was suffering from malaria, and which disease all my children contracted. My cook and all the men who were imported by the contractor building my home were also similarly afflicted. Then I learned that most of my neighbors residing along Main Street and East Broadway were suffering from the same malady. As a founding member of the RNA, Ernest suggested that the community would be more beautiful and healthful if the swamp was drained, underbrush removed, and the area generally beautified. He reached out to his father George, who had been commissioner of the parks for the city of New York for many years and had experience in using mosquito extermination techniques to fight malaria. In addition to draining the swamp and combating the mosquito infestation, the RNA also undertook a Swat the Fly campaign and instituted the first garbage collection program in the village. The RNA established their headquarters in the former home of William Valentine, a local merchant. This photo shows an early trash pickup truck and workers in front of the Valentine house. The building, which is now the library annex, was known as the Neighborhood House. Local organizations used the building for meetings and various entertainments. It was the site of many educational and recreational activities, including a kindergarten program, English and citizenship classes for immigrants, a vegetable canning and drying program, and other adult education classes. The Boy Scouts and Girl Pioneers used the neighborhood house as a clubhouse. During the spring and summer of 1916, there was an epidemic of polio or infantile paralysis. It impacted everyone in the community, regardless of economic or social standing. The RNA established a children's hospital in the neighborhood house to care for local children. They also purchased several ambulances and rented a house in Roslyn Estates for the use of Dr. George A. Draper, a recognized expert in treatment of the disease. It was only natural that this civic-minded organization would take it upon itself to come up with a way to commemorate the 146 men from Roslyn who served in World War I, and especially the 10 who gave their lives. In early 1919, the Roslyn Neighborhood Association began to make plans for a community memorial. The board established a memorial building committee and began planning a building campaign. The goal was to raise $100,000. The initial pledge drive was held the week of June 22, 1919. In late 1919, the committee initiated a design competition. They solicited proposals for a memorial building from 13 prominent New York architectural firms. 6 submitted plans. The plan of the firm of Hoppen and Cohen of New York City was ultimately chosen. Frederick Marquand Godwin, a great-grandson of William Cullen Bryant, was one of the firm's architects. The original plan included a central structure framed by a memorial rotunda on the north end and a library on the south end of the building. The main building was to include an auditorium/gymnasium with a stage and various meeting rooms. Recreational facilities such as a bowling alley and rifle range were planned for the basement level, which would connect to the existing neighborhood house. Clarence H. Mackey was designated chairman of the General Committee of the War Memorial Building Campaign. Although other affluent North Shore residents pledged significant sums, Mackey's $10,000 pledge was the largest received. Smaller amounts were also pledged or donated to the building fund by residents and business owners throughout Greater Roslyn. Unfortunately, the fund drive didn't come anywhere close to raising $100,000 in pledges. As a result, the architects were asked to scale back the project. The decision was made to eliminate foundations for the memorial rotunda and library. The committee remained hopeful that they'd eventually be able to raise the funds, and the contractor agreed to proceed in stages as funds became available. Unfortunately, these sections were never built. The building was constructed on a plot of land to the east of the neighborhood house, fronting on East Broadway. At the time, East Broadway was a major thoroughfare through Roslyn, connecting the Roslyn Depot and more sparsely populated Heights section with the bustling commercial center of the village. The street was lined with homes and businesses, as well as a Presbyterian church and the Roslyn Hotel. It was only natural that the RNA would choose to place such an important structure on such a prominent and well-traversed road. Excavation and construction of the main auditorium section began in the fall of 1920, and with great fanfare, the cornerstone was laid on October 24, 1920. Even though work on the exterior was suspended during the winter months, and there were problems with underground water when work resumed in the spring, only finishing touches were needed by the summer of 1921. Now the building needed a name. Among the names considered were Victory Hall, Roslyn Memorial Building, Memorial Neighborhood House, and War Community House. Roslyn War Memorial was the name selected. That inscription remains on the building's East Broadway facade. The first public event held in what locals came to call Memorial Hall took place in September 1921, when the recently returned body of one fallen Private James A. Lyons laid in state in the newly constructed auditorium. Lyons was 23 when he was killed in action in France in 1918. An article in the Roslyn News describes the event, stating that Lyons rested in state under a continuous military guard of his ex-comrades of the James A. Lyons American Legion Post. After months of intense planning and almost 1 year from the groundbreaking, dedication exercises for the Roslyn War Memorial Building were held on Sunday, October 2, 1921. It was a full day of celebration. An afternoon concert was held at Clarence Mackey's Harbor Hill Estate, and an evening program was held at the War Memorial. Both programs included musical selections by the United States Marine Band and soloists from the Metropolitan Opera Company. At the time of its dedication, the building was envisioned as a community center that would fulfill the educational, recreational, and social needs of all Roslyn residents. Early cultural events held at Memorial Hall included a Shakespearean play and a lecture on the national parks. Only a short distance away, the Roslyn Board of Education rented the gymnasium for physical education classes. Mrs. Childs Frick, whose mansion is now the Nassau County Museum of Art, donated $3,000 to construct and outfit a basement bowling alley. There was also a rifle range and ping pong tables. However, it doesn't appear that the building ever fully met the lofty goals set out in 1919 by members of the Roslyn Neighborhood Association. Not everyone saw the need for a new community center, being of the opinion that the neighborhood house provided adequate space for community activities. There were financial struggles as people failed to keep up their pledges, and apparently it was difficult to get local groups to use the space. RNA meeting minutes refer repeatedly to discussions of ways to raise funds to maintain the building. In the early 1920s, a period when the Ku Klux Klan was active on Long Island, the RNA board was forced to take a stand on who could use the building. In July 1922, the board received a letter from members of the James A. Lyons American Legion Post. The letter protested the use of the memorial building by African American residents. In the letter, members expressed the fear that the building would be spoiled and shunned by the better class of people. In its response, the RNA board backed its decision to approve events by African American groups, stating that it met the board's unanimous sense of fairness and propriety, and that there had been no problems with events previously held by Black organizations. The RNA provided many useful services to the community throughout the 1920s and during the Great Depression. However, by the early 1930s, there was a lag in interest in the work of the association. Many organizations no longer appointed a representative to serve on the RNA board, and many of their successful social service programs related to public health and employment had been taken over by town or county governments. One consequence was a drastic drop in financial support for the upkeep of the memorial building. In 1935, the Roslyn Neighborhood Association voted to disband and to cease operations of its properties, including the neighborhood house and the War Memorial Building. A liquidation committee was formed with the goal of investigating options to dispose of the land and buildings owned by the organization. In late 1935, the association entered into a 3-year lease with the theatrical producer Charles Hopkins. Hopkins was a well-known actor, director, and theater manager. He had built the Punch and Judy Theater on West 49th Street in 1914, renaming it the Charles Hopkins Theater in 1925. He was forced to close the theater during the Depression and was looking for a new venture. Under the name Theater of the Four Seasons, Hopkins set about renovating the War Memorial Building into a 200-seat playhouse. He enlarged the existing stage and redesigned seating in the auditorium. According to an article in the Roslyn News, the enlarged stage was as large as the average Broadway proscenium. The new playhouse opened with much acclaim on November 12, 1935. The first performance was a production of the play The Rag Picker of Paris, or The Modest Modiste. This French melodrama, originally produced on London's Royal Surrey Theatre in 1847, was adapted by novelist and playwright Christopher Morley, who lived with his wife and children in Roslyn Estates. Between 1937 and 1939, the Theater of the Four Seasons operated as a federal theater playhouse, one of several playhouses throughout the state that were part of the New York State Federal Theater Project. The building was leased to the federal government as part of the Works Progress Administration, WPA, through 1939. In June 1940, the building was leased to a group known as the Cabell Players. Under the leadership of producer David Lowe, the playhouse was renamed the Mill Pond Playhouse. Christopher Morley, who had recently ended his involvement with the Rialto Theater in Hoboken, New Jersey, was closely involved in this new incarnation of the theater. Its first summer season was opened with a production of Morley's comedy, Soft Shoulders. The Mill Pond Playhouse remained in operation through the early 1940s. A major production during that period was Christopher Morley's Trojan Horse. In 1943, Life magazine published a spread on the production showing the actors at work, living in the neighborhood house, and cavorting on the tennis courts and in Roslyn Park. With no new tenant in the wings when the Mill Pond Playhouse closed, the War Memorial Building languished on East Broadway. Community groups used it occasionally for meetings or other gatherings, and members of the veterans of foreign wars did their best to keep up with repairs. In 1944, the building was renovated for use as the Roslyn Youth Center. Open to young people ages 14 through 18, the students performed minor repairs. With the help of groups like the Kiwanis Club, money was raised to repaint the interior, sand the floors, and repair and stock the bowling alleys. The Youth Center officially opened on July 4, 1944. In addition to the bowling alleys, there were ping pong and pool tables, shuffleboard courts, and sufficient room for dancing. According to an account of the occasion in the Roslyn News, the young people completed the evening by dancing to the music of a jukebox, which had been installed the day before, and refreshments in the form of Coca-Cola were available at the Coke Bar. We're not sure how long the Youth Center was in operation. However, it is evident that by the late 1940s, the building was increasingly viewed as an eyesore and even a menace to the community. For the remaining RNA board members, it seemed the only option was to board up the building and place it, the neighborhood house, and the entire 2-acre property on the market. It was during this time that it became necessary for the Bryant Library to find a new home. Since its official establishment as the Bryant Circulating Library in 1878, the library had been housed in a frame building on the east side of Hempstead Harbor known as Bryant Hall. The hall had been built in 1874 for the people of Roslyn to use as a reading room and lecture hall. Unfortunately, the building was located in the path of the bridge being constructed by New York State over the harbor and was demolished in 1946. The library was without a permanent home. Most of the books were placed in storage, and the Library Association rented space in a storefront on Garden Street in Roslyn Heights. Recognizing that the library needed a new home, members of the Roslyn Neighborhood Association Board approached the Bryant Library Association trustees about taking over the War Memorial building for library purposes. For the next 5 years, while it waited for the court to determine the value of the demolished building, the library board went back and forth over whether to build a brand new building or accept the offered War Memorial building. Finally, in 1951, the Library Association accepted the RNA's offer. Ownership of the War Memorial Building, neighborhood house, and surrounding land was transferred to the Bryant Library. The building was remodeled, and the new library building opened to the public in 1952. Space that had been filled with actors and audiences, basketball players, and spectators was remodeled to serve the needs of library patrons. Theater seating was removed from the auditorium and replaced with shelving for books. The space that housed the Playhouse stage was transformed into a reference and reading room. In 1956, structural work to the foundation required the removal of the terrace and balustrade on East Broadway. The children's room moved down to the lower level, now the main floor. The 1950s were years of tremendous population growth in Roslyn. By the mid-1960s, the library was bursting at the seams. Patrons complained of crowded aisles and insufficient seating, as well as the lack of parking. In 1966, the library board presented a proposal to demolish the War Memorial Building and construct a new building on the opposite side of Paper Mill Road. Residents took sides, some preferring a new building, others in favor of preserving the existing War Memorial Building. When no agreement could be reached, a new proposal was presented to the public that involved moving the Valentine House across the street and constructing a 2-story, 10,000 square foot addition on the west side of the building. In 1968, the Valentine House, which had served as the RNA neighborhood house and as Roslyn Village Hall since 1962, was moved across Paper Mill Road to the spot where community tennis courts once stood and construction of the addition began. The expanded library building opened in January 1970. The new main floor housed the book browsing area and reading room. Today, what was once the main floor of the War Memorial Building is now considered the upper level of the library and houses the Bryant Room, the library's local history collection, and the Helen Glannon Community Room. Further renovations to the library building occurred over subsequent years. The children's room was renovated in the 1990s and the main floor reconfigured to support computer usage. Over 100 years later, the role of this building as a war memorial and a living evidence of appreciation for what the soldiers fought for in World War I is largely forgotten. Instead of its original mounting over the Glannon Room fireplace, the plaque commemorating those who fought is now a monument in Gary Park. However, as the Bryant Library, the building continues to perform the role ascribed to it by those members of the RNA back in 1920. It remains a center of the community and continues to be a feature in the daily life of the people of Roslyn.